Picture this. You're sitting in a notary's office in central Tirana. It is a Tuesday morning. A man in his 40s walks through the door carrying a little shopping bag. Inside it is 400,000 euros in banded cash. He's buying a 3-bedroom penthouse on the top floor of a brand new skyscraper. The paperwork takes 20 minutes. No mortgage application, no wire transfer, no credit check, no questions. According to every official record in Albania, that man earns 1,200 euros a month. So where did the bag come from? You already have an answer forming. Everyone does. Criminal networks, drug cartels, the Albanian mafia using a construction boom to wash dirty money through Tirana's skyline. And yes, that world is real, but it explains maybe 10% of what you're looking at. The other 90% is something far stranger, far more human, and in its own way, far more tragic. It is the story of a country that watched its entire life savings vanish overnight in the greatest financial delusion of the 20th century, and then made a collective, rational decision to never trust a bank again. We're going to follow millions of euros stuffed inside walls, a diaspora pipeline of cash suitcases crossing every border in Europe, and a real estate frenzy that is quietly holding the entire country together. This is Albania's shadow economy, the money that never hits the banks. To understand why Albanians don't trust banks, you have to understand what money meant in Albania for nearly 50 years. The answer is almost nothing. From 1944 until 1991, Albania was governed by one of the most fanatically isolated regimes in human history. Enver Hoxha did not merely seal the borders, he sealed the mind. Private property was abolished. Private enterprise was a criminal act. Owning more than your neighbour was ideologically suspicious. The state decided what you ate, where you worked, and what you were allowed to think about the outside world. At its peak, Albania had roughly 1 bunker built for every 4 citizens, 700,000 concrete domes scattered across the countryside like a paranoid rash, monuments to a government that trusted no one. In this system, personal wealth accumulation was not just impossible. It was dangerous. Money as a concept, as something you could save, invest, grow or lose, was functionally absent from the lived experience of 2 full generations. People were paid wages, yes, but those wages were set by the state, spent in state stores, and existed in a closed loop that bore no resemblance to a functioning market economy. Then, in 1991, the walls came down, the regime collapsed, and suddenly 4 million people who had spent their entire lives inside one of the most controlled economies on earth were told they were free to participate in capitalism, free to invest, free to build wealth. They had absolutely no idea what that meant, and the people who showed up to explain it to them were not economists, they were predators. What happened next was not just a financial catastrophe, it was a psychological wound that Albania has never fully closed. The pyramid schemes arrived like a miracle. That is the only way to understand why an entire country walked into them with open arms. By the mid-1990s, a handful of companies had begun offering savings accounts with returns that were, by any rational measure, impossible. Some promised 50% interest per year, some promised 10% per month. The most aggressive promise returns that would double your money in 60 days. In a functioning financial system, with a literate investing public, these numbers would have triggered immediate suspicion. In Albania, they triggered a gold rush. The government watched, some officials invested. The companies sponsored football clubs, ran advertisements on state television, and set up offices in every city and major town. By 1996, an estimated 2/3 of the Albanian population had money inside these schemes. Families liquidated their savings, farmers sold their livestock, emigrants wired home every euro they had earned working construction in Greece and Italy, so that relatives could deposit it before the window closed. The total sum absorbed was somewhere between $1 and $2 billion, an almost incomprehensible figure for a country of that size. In early 1997, the schemes collapsed. All of them, at once. The money was simply gone. There was no insurance, there was no bailout, there was no mechanism for recovery. People who had sold everything they owned were left with nothing. The government, widely perceived as complicit, lost all legitimacy overnight. Armed civilians raided military depots. 700,000 weapons flooded the streets. The state essentially ceased to function. 1,500 people died in the ensuing violence. The United Nations deployed a multinational protection force. Albania had tried capitalism for 5 years and ended up in a civil war. The lesson every Albanian drew from that experience was permanent, bone deep, and completely rational. No institution can be trusted with your money. Not ever. Not again. After 1997, the behaviour shift was not irrational. It was adaptive. It was the only logical response to what had just happened. A generation that had grown up under a state that owned everything watched the first attempt at private finance detonate and take their savings with it. So they made a decision that economists would spend the next 3 decades struggling to reverse. They took their money out of the system entirely. They brought it home. They put it in drawers, in suitcases, behind loose wall tiles, under floorboards, inside the hollow legs of wooden furniture. They kept it where they could see it, touch it, and count it themselves. This was not a fringe behaviour. This was not a criminal behaviour. This was the dominant financial strategy of an entire nation. The Bank of Albania has estimated that somewhere between 3 and 5 billion euros are circulating outside the formal banking system at any given time. That figure is almost certainly conservative, because by definition, money that is being deliberately hidden from institutions is also being hidden from the statisticians trying to count it. The psychological architecture of this behaviour is not hard to understand. In Albanian culture, the concept of besa, a code of absolute personal trust and honour, sits at the centre of how relationships are organised. Besa is kept between people. It is not extended to abstractions. A bank is an abstraction. A building full of strangers making decisions with your life savings is an abstraction. The mattress is not an abstraction. You can sleep on it. You know exactly what is inside it. The tragedy is that this logic is not wrong. It is simply incompatible with a modern economy, and it was about to generate consequences no one predicted. If you cannot put your money in a bank, you have to make it somewhere the banks cannot see. And in the mountains of southern Albania, in the terraced valleys of Permet and Tepelina, and the highlands above Vlora, that somewhere turned out to be cannabis. The shift happened quietly in the late 1990s and through the 2000s, as Albanian farmers looked at the economic wreckage around them and began making pragmatic calculations. Legal crops generated legal income, which meant visible income, which meant taxable, traceable, institutionally legible money, the precise kind of money this population had decided to avoid. Cannabis generated cash. It was paid for in cash, transported in cash, and converted into cash at every stage of the chain. It was, for a generation of rural Albanians living off the formal grid, a perfect fit. By the early 2010s, satellite imagery was revealing cannabis cultivation on a scale that stunned European law enforcement. The village of Lazara, near Gjirokasta, had become one of the largest cannabis production centres on the European continent, a self-governing settlement of 4,000 people generating an estimated 4 to 5 billion euros annually, operating so openly that it had its own internal checkpoints. The Albanian state did not control it, it barely approached it. Lazaret was eventually raided and dismantled in 2014 in a major government operation, but the infrastructure and the networks it had built, the couriers, the routes, the cash conversion chains did not disappear. They dispersed. The green economy went back underground, feeding into the same shadow channels that were already carrying another enormous river of untraceable cash, the one flowing in from abroad. At its peak, roughly 1 in 3 Albanians was living outside Albania. They had left in waves, first in 1991, when the regime fell and the borders opened and people walked into the sea to reach Italian cargo ships, then through the 1990s and into the 2000s, following work to Greece, Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They went where the wages were, and then, with the loyalty and obligation that runs through Albanian culture like bedrock, they sent the money home. Remittances became, quietly, the most important financial engine in the country. At their height, They accounted for somewhere between 15 and 20% of Albania's entire GDP, a proportion that rivals some of the most remittance-dependent economies on Earth. The official figures, as always, are almost certainly undercounts, because a significant portion of that money never travelled through a wire transfer, a Western Union counter, or any traceable financial instrument. It travelled in people's pockets, in envelopes and carry-on luggage, in the kind of cash handoff that happens at a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, between a son who spent 6 months on a construction site in Milan and a mother who will tile the bathroom and pay the doctor and keep the rest behind the radiator. This was not a crime. This was a family doing what families do when they do not trust institutions. The effect on the Albanian economy was enormous and almost entirely invisible to official measurement. Billions of euros were being injected into the country annually, building houses, funding small businesses, and sustaining consumption, entirely off the books, entirely outside the formal system, and with nowhere obvious to go, until the construction industry figured out where to put it. Stand on any hill overlooking Tirana today and count the cranes. On a clear morning you can see dozens of them. Glass towers are rising across a city that 30 years ago had a skyline of 5-story communist-era apartment blocks and nothing else. The scale of construction is remarkable for a country of 3 million people with an official GDP per capita that ranks it among the poorest in Europe. The logic of what is happening is not complicated, even if the mechanics are deliberately obscured. Cash that cannot be deposited, that cannot be wired, that cannot be declared, cash sitting in walls and suitcases and kitchen drawers across Albania and the diaspora, needs to become something else. It needs to become an asset. Real estate is the oldest and most reliable vehicle for that conversion in the world. A developer builds a tower, buyers pay in cash. The transaction is recorded at a declared value that bears little resemblance to the actual price. The building goes up. The apartments sit empty because they were never meant to be lived in. They were meant to be laundered. The physical structure transforms invisible, unaccountable euros into a registered, taxable, legally recognised asset that can now be sold, borrowed against, or simply held as stored wealth. The result is a construction boom that has no obvious demand basis. Tirana has a serious housing crisis, and also thousands of empty luxury apartments. Prices in some districts have surpassed those in Lisbon and Warsaw. Buildings are rising faster than the population can plausibly fill them, and international regulators have been watching all of this with increasing alarm, building a case that is now threatening to become an existential crisis for the Albanian economy. In June 2020, the Financial Action Task Force, the global financial crimes watchdog, placed Albania on its grey list. The designation is not a sanction. It is something more insidious. It is an official signal to the world's banking system that Albania's anti-money laundering controls are inadequate, that its financial supervision is weak, and that doing business with Albanian institutions carries elevated risk. The consequences cascaded quickly. Correspondent banking relationships, the partnerships that allow Albanian banks to process international transactions, became harder to maintain. Foreign direct investment cooled. Insurance costs for businesses operating internationally have increased. The pathway toward European Union membership, which Albania had formally pursued since 2014, became visibly more complicated. Brussels made it explicit. A grey-listed country cannot meet the financial governance standards required for accession. For the Albanian government, this was not an abstract diplomatic problem. It was a structural one. The economy that had been quietly sustained by shadow cash for 3 decades was now being asked to become legible, to produce records, to enforce reporting requirements, to push transactions through trackable channels on a timeline set by external institutions with no particular understanding of or sympathy for the historical reasons the shadow economy existed in the first place. The paradox was almost perfectly cruel. The informal economy had kept Albania functioning through poverty, civil war, institutional collapse, and international neglect. Now the price of joining the modern world was dismantling the very system that had held the country together. Albania was removed from the grey list in 2023. but the structural tension it exposed did not resolve. It simply moved underground again, where it has always been most comfortable. Albania is attempting something extraordinarily difficult. It is trying to become a different country without breaking the one that currently exists. The formal ambitions are real. EU accession negotiations are underway. Tax digitization programs are being rolled out. Banking penetration is slowly increasing, particularly among younger Albanians who didn't live through 1997 and do not carry the same visceral distrust of institutions in their bodies. The government has introduced real estate reporting requirements, cracked down on large cash transactions, and begun making the kinds of regulatory gestures that Brussels demands. But the shadow economy does not disappear because the law changes. It adapts. The cash that once moved in Lidl bags now moves through shell companies. The construction invoices that once declared a fraction of the real sale price now involve more sophisticated documentation. The behavioural logic that produced the shadow economy, the conviction that institutions are predatory and that only physical, personal and untraceable assets can be truly trusted, does not dissolve in a generation. It is cultural sediment laid down over decades of trauma, and it is passed between grandparents and grandchildren at kitchen tables, in the same rooms where the cash is still stored behind the radiator. The Albanian state needs the shadow economy to slow down in order to build a legitimate future. The Albanian population needs it to continue because it is still, for millions of people, the only financial system they trust. Neither side is wrong. That is what makes this a trap rather than a problem. The man with the Lidl bag will keep walking into that notary's office. The crane will keep turning. And somewhere in the walls of a half-empty skyscraper in Tirana, the money that never hits the banks will keep doing exactly what it has always done, surviving. If this story made you think differently about what an economy actually is, not a spreadsheet, but a set of decisions made by traumatized people trying to survive, share it with someone who still thinks shadow economies are just about crime. And if you want more deep dives into the financial systems the official data refuses to explain, subscribe. The next one is already being built.